topic on versioned data stores this evening, and it's probably one of the more unique talks you're going to hear at, I would say, most software development meetups. So really excited. Bill is going to be sharing with us. Thanks for taking the time to prepare for this. I want to also give a huge shout out to all of our sponsors. Gotham Go, the conference that really got plugged in here with the Go New York meetup and kept it going. Deep Source, our newest, and JetBrains, who gives us an IDE or two to give out at every meeting, and tonight is no exception. And also JFrog, who is a swag sponsor, Zoom sponsor, and sponsors my time, actually, because I'm an employee of JFrog, but this is considered an after-hours activity for me. Want to encourage everybody. I've been doing good on the YouTube numbers. I haven't looked at them today, but definitely I think we're getting close to that 200 subscriber mark fairly quickly. And our videos are getting a lot of views, and I do my best to optimize those. But feel free to go ahead and use a QR code and subscribe to our Golang New York YouTube channel. Now, I'm going to have a speaker for next month. We're going to have a Go meetup. However, right now I don't have one officially locked in. So if you have been thinking about wanting to give a talk, if you want to just throw some topics my way, send me a note. I'm on the Go Slack channel. So you can always reach out to me during the day if you have some ideas you want to run by me to see if you think it'd be of value. Chances are the answer is yes, because you all experience different things on a daily basis, and your experiences are really what provides a lot of motivation for your peers. So it'd be really great for you to do that. So you don't have, if you'd like to go fill out the call for paper, please do, but it doesn't have to always be that formal. You can always go right ahead and Slack me, and we can see if you have something that you would like to share, because chances are you have really unique experiences. And also another fact, which I don't know if you know, but we have 100% survival rate of people that have given their talks here. No one's ever lost their life from giving a talk at Golang New York. So this is really safe. You're in a safe environment, so this should be good. JetBrains IDE giveaway. So I'm going to try something different in a few moments. I'm going to put a Google form or a Google Sheet rather in the chat shortly. And that Google Sheet is going to ask you for your name and your email address. We are going to use the wheel of names and see if we could pick our IDE winners that way. So if you're interested, I don't have to collect your name. You can just add your name to the Google form, and then at the end, we'll spin the wheel. I'll do it live, and you'll see who your winners are. I want to, JFrog, actually, our sponsor, our swag sponsor, is going to do a giveaway this month as well. For those of you who don't know about JFrog, we are a DevOps software company. I say we because I do work for them. We have been around since 2008, and many people know us by our flagship product, Artifactory. What I want to also share is that we are going to be doing a raffle this evening for a Google Home Hub. I noticed I was in the Amazon ecosystem for a little while, but this is a Go meetup, and it was time to enter the right ecosystem. And we're going to be giving out a Google Hub. I can't do this drawing live. However, if you enter by going to the QR code or the link that you see here, which I also will drop soon, we will pick a winner within 2 business days. You will be contacted by email, and then we'll share the winner's name with the entire meetup. So looking forward to doing that. And we're thankful that JFrog has a prize like that available. Also, one other thing I want to mention is that we have our DevOps, we have a DevOps conference coming up that is free. It's a virtual conference on May 26th. And 27th, and it is I want to give you a 2-day pass for free. There's one day that's free. That's May 26th. May 27th is a technical deep dive day, and we're going to have a CEO panel as well with some companies that I know you're aware of, like Datadog, HashiCorp, Elastic, PagerDuty. So we have a real exciting lineup, and of course JFrog will be there. And we have tons and tons of content and tons of technical information. I will drop that in the Slack for anyone that's looking to go to another virtual conference. So it'd be nice to get to these in person again soon. I think it's going to happen sooner rather than later. We're already talking about going back to the office plans a little bit. Nothing solid yet, but we're getting into those conversations. So it's very, very exciting. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn this over to our speaker this evening, Bill Katz. Bill, I'm going to allow you to introduce yourself because I think you're going to do it much better justice than I, because you have a really, really impressive background. So I'd love to turn it over to you, and you can share at will, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Bill Katz. I work at Janelia Research Campus, which is over in Virginia. And I work on reconstruction of brains, mostly using fruit flies. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about a topic that's been very of great interest to me, which is versioned data stores. And so let me see if I can get this going here. First the share, then the play. And hopefully you seeing the screen or the master. Hey Ari, can you hear me?
Yes, we see the screen. I mean, we see it says what we'll cover is taking up the whole screen.
Okay, awesome. So basically, I'm going to talk about versioning of data, and in particular, I'm going to start off with an example that's kind of a detour out of the field in terms of what you might normally encounter, which is how we basically reconstruct brain circuits at our research center, and why versioning is so important, and basically why I built the system that I did initially, which led me to some interest in how do we actually version data. You hear a lot about people wanting the GitHub of data, Git for data, but it's pretty complicated when you actually start thinking about how you would do that with data as opposed to like what we normally think of with source control versioning. And so the first part will be basically talking about some of my research and how, the types of versioning that come from it and why I use it. And the second thing is how do we build the versioning systems? And I'm going to be going through a lot of systems just at a very, very high level, but I mean, at a high level, but actually looking at the underlying algorithm. And the amazing thing is that all of these systems were built on Go. So if you go to the GitHub, they're all open source, and you can go to the GitHub repositories, and you can check out the language, and Go is a fairly large percentage of each package. And so let's just start with brain reconstruction. And so why the fly? Because that's what our group is studying. And so if you look at a whole range of organisms, C. elegans, the worm, Drosophila, the fruit fly, mouse, monkey, and humans, if you want to reconstruct the brain, that's basically trying to find out how all the neurons are connected, the exact neural circuitry. You can start with the very simple organisms, C. elegans, the worm, at 302 neurons. If you go to the fruit fly, which you can barely see, there are these, sometimes if you're drinking wine or any kind of fruit, you might see them hovering around. They're really, really tiny, much smaller than your normal, house fly. They would have about 100,000 neurons. When you get to the mouse, you have about 70 million neurons. When you get to the monkey, it's about 7 billion neurons. And so if you want to make an analogy between the different sizes of these brains with like a population, 302 might be, if we're lucky, the number of people that might see this on YouTube. So a little bit more than the number of subscribers. If you then think about the Drosophila brain, now you're talking more about like the population of Iceland. If you move to the mouse, you're talking about the population of England. If you start thinking about monkeys in terms of scale, now we're at the whole population of Earth. And then if you think about humans with 86 billion neurons, it's about 12, the population of 12 Earths together. So really, we don't want to necessarily, we can't go directly to humans. We're barely able to do the fly. And at the cutting edge of where we are right now, we're just at the process of doing the first fruit fly. Now, why, do flies, are they similar enough to humans to warrant all this attention? Well, yeah, so one of the interesting things is that they have a lot of behavior that's very similar to, what humans do. So this is two flies battling out male versus male aggression to establish dominance. We also know that male flies who are continuously rejected by female flies actually turn to alcohol. This was a study that was partly done at our research campus. And this is a fruit fly that's sucking down some alcohol, preferentially compared to other males who could mate, that they just drink normal water. And so they're sort of self-medicating. There's a situation where if you have a fly and they're presented with a gap like this, well, we all know that they have pretty good motor responses if you ever try to swat a fruit fly. My wife can never catch them. But flies can also learn their body sizes, and they can also judge the width of the gap when presented with it. So in this video, you kind of see a fly that tries to cross the gap because it actually thinks it can. It has a sense of its own size. And if a gap is much larger than this, it won't even try. But when it sees the gap and says, yeah, that's about, I can do that, then it tries to do that. In this particular thing, example, the bottom row is our control subjects, and the top have been treated optogenetically, which is they've been genetically altered such that a light can actually stimulate a particular neuron. And we know that this neuron actually causes an interesting response. And so I'll start the video here, and you'll see the neuroactivation at the top, whereas the control group on the bottom is a little bit different. And so any second now, then they got the light, and then they take off. And so flies, we can actually really hit them with genetic alterations. We can, and because they're so small, we can actually analyze it. So how do we actually get at the neural circuits themselves? How do we reconstruct it? Well, one way that you can do this is you can imagine that you take like a fly brain and encase it in a block, and then you start sectioning it. And this is kind of a little bit of an older technique, but still has the same principles. You zap it with electrons, and you take a picture. And each of these like images of the brain tissue can then be color coded using a artificial intelligence scheme, which tries to figure out how do you group these pixels into neurons. And then when you stack them all up, you can get a three-dimensional representation of the neuron. And it doesn't quite do justice for the scale at what we're operating. And so what I'll do is I'll kind of, this is an interesting animation I pulled off the web, but it kind of shows a grain of salt there, and then there's a T cell at 7 micrometers. And now you're down to HIV T cells, 7 micrometers. The bacteria there is at 1 micrometer. Well, each pixel in the images that we acquire are close to 1,000 times smaller than that bacteria that you're seeing. And so it's really, really tiny, the resolution. And when we acquire the images, it's pretty breathtaking when you can actually see. So what we're doing is we're kind of zooming into the brain of a fruit fly. We're just moving into it, scrolling through the three-dimensional, the three-dimensional cube that you can see up here as it's changing the orientation. Pretty soon you start seeing the neurons themselves, the cells, and the components, the subcellular components within the neurons themselves. And here it's just like all at the detail, very, very close in. And then we're going to scroll back out. But the amazing thing is that one little fruit fly that you can barely see with your eye, when you take the brain and you image it at this resolution to construct a massive image volume, this constitutes about what you're seeing here, about 50 teravoxels. So if you're able to compress it using three-dimensional JPEG, you may be down to about 25 terabytes. That is 25 terabytes for one tiny speck of a fly's brain. And it's a lot of data just for a fruit fly. And so what we want to do is now we want to use artificial intelligence to figure out what each little pixel in the 25 teravoxels constitute, like we want to assign a label per neuron. And to do this, we teamed up with a really cool research lab at Google that uses deep learning systems. And so this requires an incredible amount of computation. Thankfully, our colleagues at Google, they run it on their network because it would cost us probably a couple of $100,000 just to run a segmentation like this on the volumes that we generate. And so you can see here that this is just showing one neuron, how it kind of grows out a neuron. Imagine this happening for, the tens of thousands of neurons that we're doing it all throughout the brain. So approximately about 100,000 for the whole brain, but depending on the size of the brain, much smaller. So even if the automated segmentation is mostly right, we still need to do a lot of manual proofreading after the AI gets done with things. And so this is an example of like after the segmentation, you might have a neuron that's over here, and this is all classified as one neuron, but there are obviously topological errors, some issues where the AI has gone wrong. And one of the reasons is because when you're doing the deep learning, the field of view for a convolutional neural network is quite small. It's only seeing a little bit of the picture. And this is part of active research, just trying to make deep learning do better for analyzing the images. But because we need a lot of proofreaders, we employ a lot of people that need to be trained, a lot of people that need to actually go in and do the work. And so a lot of what we do is dependent upon these experts that go in and use our tools. So as an example, here's a neuron that's being manipulated in 3D with New3, one of the tools that's developed by a colleague of mine, Xiao Ting. And you can see how the proofreaders just manually separate the neurons. It's a time-consuming process, but we try to do this as minimally as possible. But the end result is, along with all the image data that you saw, the massive amount of image volume, there's a labeling for each voxel that represents the neurons. And that now we get to the crucial thing, which is how does versioned data fit into this? How do we handle all this amount of data that we're getting for the reconstruction? And so I designed a system called DVID, which really provides a science API. It's all written in Go, it's open source. And this uses the Go HTTP package to provide a way that they can do HTTP requests. And then eventually, this is all very high level connectomics work in these packages. But everything gets boiled down to a storage API where it just uses key value stores in the backend. So key value stores, you're probably familiar with. It's a very simple API. You can get a key, so you get back a value for that key. You can put a key value, you can delete a key. So the actual store is very simple, but you build a versioning layer on top of it. So what is versioning? Let's get a little bit more particular. So one thing that you can talk about in versioning is that you could do it like linearly. And sometimes it's called time travel versioning, where you have time 0 and then you move to time 1 and then you use the time 2. But it's all linear so that you can backtrack and it's not branched like this. So when we think of Git, we think more of branches, where this could be like the main branch and then there could be like a development branch here. And so versioning can either be linear or it can be branched. And the other thing to think about is the a space versus granularity issue, which is within each version, you can either do a very granular change with every kind of mutation that happens within your data set. Now, it's sometimes more appropriate to use checkpoints. And that's what Git does, is that we wait until we accumulate enough changes and then we do a commit, and then that goes in as a commit version. But imagine if, for example, we went to a certain granularity where instead of waiting for files and then eventually we do a manual commit, we actually logged every keystroke of when we changed a file of the source code that we were dealing with. Well, that's like really overkill. And so that would also cost a lot of extra data to be generated just so that we could get the level of granularity that we want. So when you're thinking of versioning, it's not just whether it's linear or branch, but also what is the granularity of the versioning. So in the DVID system that I did, this is just showing the branch versioning, where you start off here with the initial version, and the image data that you saw that we were generating. First, we throw that in at this version, we ingest all this image volume, and then we ingest all the stuff that we get from Google that labels each of the voxels with it. And then we start the proofreading operations, where we start, going down, creating new commits. Then we do the changes by the proofreading team. We do more edits. And then there could be a branch here where we're trying out like a new technique or something like that. And so this is basically how we use branch versioning within DVID. Now, there are a number of things that actually came up that we didn't actually realize is useful. Like one thing that was pretty obvious is quality control. So if someone commits some changes, some proofreading at this version, and we find out later, wow, someone did something wrong, we can actually go back to original versions just to see, like, sort of a blame, to see which proofreader actually added that thing, or was it an algorithm that added something wrong? So quality control, we kind of knew we were getting. It was surprising that branch versioning also let us do training very well, which is, it's a very difficult process to figure out how to split the neurons, how to look at the imagery. And so what we can do is we can start off here where there's not been much proofreading, and then as proofreading gets done on the main branch, it eventually, like a neuron, gets entirely fleshed in. And it might be artificially fragmented. But then what we can do is we can assign the proofreaders to go back to this original version, use the same tools that we would use here, but now take a look at it. And all of these proofreaders, there's one node for every proofreader. So they have their own little compartment where they can look at the data, and they can try to do the merge. And at that point, we can also say, hey, take a look at your output compared to, the expert output, the stuff that's been checked all the way at this version. So this is kind of an interesting thing that came out of it, which is you can use branch versioning for training, where you can actually see that if something was more curated, more, verified at one point, and then you can use it to train how proofreaders actually learn the process. This is actually what the version DAG looked like for one of our smaller data sets when we were starting off. I've zoomed out so you can barely see it, but the green is the master branch so that you can see the main branch that's intertwined here. And you can see these massive fan outs, and they correspond to points in time where, especially at the very beginning, it was a relatively new data set. People weren't quite sure about the anatomy and how to actually look at things. So while we went all the way down here and already proofread certain portions of it, we can start training new proofreaders or the proofreaders and then go and have them take a look at back and forth. So the other thing too that we found is that when you're using branch versioning, and so once again, this is where we loaded in, the grayscale image data and the segmentation and the proofreaders. It turns out that especially if you have massive amounts of data that change over time, but the biggest changes happen at the very beginning when you're acquiring the imagery, when you're doing the automated segmentation from all of the deep learning. So there's a massive set of changes that occurs here. And once you lock that node, it's all immutable. So rather than look at a database, if you actually had to store this in a database where everything, all the data is always changing, and so therefore you had to have it in some sort of a system that always allowed any part of it to change, it makes a lot of sense to sort of think about things in terms of versioning where you could actually do the commit and then decrease the amount that actually needs to be stored in a real like mutable database. And then maybe use all of this other stuff, just put it in an immutable store. And I won't get a chance to talk about some of the research there that's going on, but this is an actually very interesting way of thinking about versioning, which is, we might actually be able to separate the immutable from the mutable and have a lot of savings as well as, cacheability and various other things, even have this served by like you could serve this through AWS Open Data if we publish the data to the public, but then keep private data. It's putting a veneer of mutability on top of immutable. And you'll see that recurring over and over. And of course, the kind of holy grail of all this distributed versioning is to have something like Git, where you actually have distributed collaborative editing. And so an example of this might be, this is all within the FlyEM campus, but you want to publish the data to some place where the public can see it. So you publish it outside the firewall, just one of these versions here. But the proofreading and the other development work within our campus keeps on going on. So all of this is pretty private, but we might have some remote collaborators, some colleagues, we can actually send them a disk drive, because sometimes that's the simplest way of transmitting terabytes of information. And then this corresponds to the same version here, and they can just go off and make their changes and then maybe do a pull request. So this is like the goal. Now, when you talk about stuff that's being done more like by companies right now, you'll see stuff like this, which is the Data Bazaar. This is QRI, one of the Go-based commercial companies that is doing data versioning. And so they're approaching it very much like GitHub, where they have a whole bunch of data sets that they're allowing people to download. It's pretty cool. You can go to qri.cloud and then do some searches for data sets. Most of these data sets are CSV files. In fact, that was pretty much what I could see were spreadsheets. And so it's data that's in the form of files. Dolt, which is kind of a play on Git, is another Go package that was originally derived from NOMS, which was an earlier Go system for doing versioned databases. And so Dolt is kind of cool. They have their Dolt Hub, but they're what I would call like a true versioned database. And so we're going to talk a little bit about QRI, a little bit about Dolt, but at a very high level, as well as my own work. And so what we can start off by saying is, okay, I'm throwing out a lot of stuff at you in terms of the different ways that we were already talking about versioning. When you talk about QRI and Dolt and DVID, are there some kind of general ways that you can think of how they're approaching versioning? And one way is to think about what's the kind of model that they're using. And so you can version essentially on files. So you're thinking that you've got like a directory of files, and you're gonna do versioning on that set of files. And Git is the obvious example of that. So when we have source code, it's a bunch of directories which have a bunch of programming files in them. And then we use Git to actually store the data. It converts it into blocks of data that then it knows, the commit history, where things were. It keeps track of all the bookkeeping necessary to do the data. Now, QRI relies on something called IPFS, which is Interplanetary File Systems, which is also originally written in Go and has a huge ecosystem. You may have heard of Interplanetary File Systems because Protocol Labs, which is a company that got financed and put out Filecoin, which is one of the new cryptocurrencies, that they're building out an entire ecosystem for how to use blockchains and how to use storage. And much of the original code there is all open source. They're doing really cool stuff. I suggest you check it out at Protocol Labs, ipfs.io. So QRI is built on that. And QRI primarily uses CSV, does a lot of the handling like Git does about managing where the files go and how do you do things. I'm going to do a disservice to both QRI and DOLT because I'm not really talking about the very high level stuff. I'm going to be focusing more on how they actually implement versioning, as opposed to how they orchestrate, what are their focuses on in terms of doing like the pull requests and the management of the overall flow. So both Git and QRI kind of work on files. That's the frame of mind that they're looking at, as far as I can tell. Now, for QRI. Now, Pachyderm is another Go language company or built on Go, and they specialize on kind of thinking about pipelines. So if you're doing machine learning, if you got some sort of a pipeline where you want to version control all the components, the code, the data, whatnot, Pachyderm does that. And so it's still kind of file-based too, in the sense that you've got files, you've got data that's built in. You're pulling stuff together, and so it's still thinking about files, but now you're adding in a lot of control over how you're doing the pipelines. When you get to real, I would say like real databases in the sense of I want to store data using like a key value database or a SQL. A relational database. And I also want to be able to just version it. Then we're talking about stuff like, the layers that I built into DVID and DOLT. There's also a few other databases and obviously a lot more pipelines and files. Literally everything here in green is all Go, and that's why I've described it. So what are the other types of ways that you can think of versioning? Well, you can think of it in terms of can other clients access your data before you actually do a commit? And so, for example, in Git, we have this notion that, okay, I'm going to check in files, I'm going to add files, and it really goes into your working directory. At some point, you do the commit, it's still on your local machine, and you may push it like to GitHub. And so you could potentially open up a browser, like for example, with READMEs on the GitHub page, and then commit directly onto that GitHub repository. But quite frequently, what we think of is, okay, we have a working directory, no one else has access to this, we've got our own little private silo. A very different way of thinking about this, and this goes more for the shared database kind of versioning approach, is that you got all these people and they're making writes, but they're not doing it privately. They're doing it to some service that sits out there, and they're applying their mutations directly. The question then becomes, is it that every single change that they do, is that versioned, which is what I was talking about before, which was highly granular. And I believe that's what DOLT is doing, because they want to have a full graph about what's going on in terms of the changes so that they can go back. Now, one of the issues with that is that you could eventually get into a situation where you're storing a lot of data. And that was actually one of the issues with NOMS, which DOLT was built on. So the other way to think about this is our version sealed or open with a restriction? So in Git, once you commit something, that's committed. Like it's like you could go in and try and modify it and muck with it and rechange it, but the way it's actually stored doesn't change. It's not doing it in place right. It's basically just going to add some more immutable stuff and then refer to it. And one of the reasons behind this is that if you're doing versioning and then you're sealing it, quite frequently what they do is they use a content addressable hash, which is if you have a file and I run a hash on it and you've got a nice, sequence of letters or bits, it's a hash. If you change that content in any way, the hash will change. And so you can say that content addressable hash kind of represents, it's like a SHA. It's like it's a checksum. It provides a way to say that this data will not change. And so it's sealed. Once you do that, you're not going to change the stuff inside without changing the actual identifier. Now, the other possibility is that you could think of versioning that. So if you use the content addressable hash as the version itself, the version ID, you're kind of conflating the sealing with the versioning. Because now, if you're saying this is the version of the data, you're not going to be able to change anything into it. Now, another way of thinking about versions is that it's like a identifier that acts as a state ID, which is, look, I have a bunch of data. It's at this particular point in time, and I want to represent it using this identifier, this UUID, this universal unique identifier, or some other kind of key. And when you do that, what it means is that, okay, let's say I had all those labeled data, that segmentation, but now, it's locked. That's the way that we actually analyze that whole volume of data. If I were to actually say there's a neuron in there, that's not going to change. But let's say I develop a new visualization application, a new way to show the meshes and beautiful imagery. I might want to actually now do a denormalization where I take that data and create new data that represents it. I mean, fundamentally, it's the same, but it's tailored toward a particular new form, a new application. Yeah, the data is different, but it's the same version from the standpoint of we're looking at the data set as a whole. And so this is kind of a different way of looking at versioning, which is what we do in the scientific world, which is because we might actually want to reach into that DAG, in a particular commit and say, hey, I just figured out a new way to visualize something. I'm going to reach into that version. I'm not going to mess with any of the sealed data, but I'm going to add some stuff. And this can happen by adding layers on top of this. So that's not to say that these two are different. It's just something to keep in mind. So that's basically an introduction to versioning in general. Now we're going to get to the nitty-gritty about how you would actually implement versioning in data. And I'm going to get into a little bit of database and some various other stuff. I guess I'm wondering if I should ask if there's any questions now before we get into the other stuff, or I could just move on. I'll give you a couple seconds.
You can unmute yourself, or you can drop it in the chat if you prefer to do that.
I'm not sure I can actually see the chat.
I'll read it to you.
Or you can read out any questions.
Sure.
All right, yeah. Okay, so if there's no questions, so there's two approaches that I'm going to talk about, at least here, because there's way too much information. And even this is probably too much, but I just wanted to give you a flavor for how you might actually go about implementing versioning in data. And one way is to use the files approach like we were talking about. The other way is to use the databases approach. I'm going to show how to do these two different things. Now, QRI, I think actually you're supposed to pronounce it query. So I should try to say that. Query is built on IPFS, which is the Interplanetary File System, which is in turn built on the interplanetary, I think it's called linked data. So all of these are Go packages. I mean, the IPFS is like a whole Go project. IPLD is a Go project, but the prototypes, the initial stuff, they're all Go. Take a look at it. It's really cool. There's videos on IPLD in IPFS. IPLD has very Go-like syntax for describing data, but it's just too much stuff and we can't really get into it. But it's primarily Web 3.0, how you can do distributed content, distributed storage. And QRI just reuses a lot of this and builds in layers on top of it. So it leverages all of this stuff here. And then the database stuff, I'm just going to show you the simplest possible way you can get versioning using a standard key value store. So what I tell you, you could probably implement just after this talk. It's really easy. It's what I did for DVID, and it's really managed. It's done well, given the fact that we've held, terabytes and terabytes of information, and it's been used on really large scientific reconstructions. And then I'm going to talk about a custom data structure, which is used in DOLT, which is a lot more complicated, where I'm just going to actually give you a look at under the hood. So for distributed data, it really, the primary data structure for all of this is called the Merkle DAG. And it's really a foundation of a lot of the versioned data. And one of the key concepts is immutability, that you want to build, mutability on immutability, but also use cryptography, or at least hashing and other things, to make sure that the data that has been already stored in an immutable format cannot be hacked, it cannot be changed, that you're guaranteed that things will always be as intended based on a simple string that comes from it, the final hash. And so let's just quickly talk about the Merkle DAG, which is, what you can think about is there's a whole bunch of files here. So this comes from proto.school. So you can look at HTTP proto school. This is, I think, put out by Protocol Labs. It's a very nice tutorial system that shows you, it'll introduce you to IPLD, IPFS, all these new concepts, frankly, of how to use distributed data, and all of it's very accessible in Go. So what you do is you let's say you have goldfish, so like fish images, and you have cat images. And so it's a file name and content, which would be like the bytes representing a JPEG or whatnot. And for each of these chunks of data, you basically want to create a identifier, a content identifier. And it should be something that's a content addressable hash or some kind, that based on the data, the bytes that you see here, you run it through some kind of algorithm that spits out a whole bunch of characters that uniquely represent this thing. So if you change one byte in here, this is going to change. And so for each of the files, we generate these content identifiers. And then you notice how these are all fish here. So we're going to create a folder of fish. And the children of this folder node here will point. It has pointers, but the pointers are content identifiers. And so that's one of the key interesting things here is, instead of pointers, that you're basically using content identifiers. And so if something else got replicated here, like if somehow or another in some other place, goldfish.ping got reintroduced, well, that content identifier is going to be the same. Hopefully you're going to reuse that blob. And so you're not going, it's a deduplication of the data underneath. And so at this level, we got a node here for the folder fish that have all the fish pings, a folder for the cats that have all the cat pings. And then we can keep on doing this ad nauseum, going up the thing, have a folder called pics that now have both the fish and the cats. Now, the interesting thing is that as you move up this layer, what you also want to do is that the content identifier here, that hash, the identifier represents rolling up all of the content identifiers of its children. And this is kind of like where if you've studied blockchains, if you've studied a lot of these other techniques before, it's the same principle over again, which is that we start off with these immutable chunks of data that are represented by some sort of, hash or something that represents the data. And then we sort of combine them and generate a new hash based on all of those. And then we might combine other chunks, and the combination then gets another hash. And so we keep on building higher and higher layers. And so you can see that you could represent a ton of data by just scaling up and up and up. But the root content identifier, that will represent all of this immutable data in here. If you change one byte down here, that if it was to go back and redo it, it could tell that, oh, my content identifier does not match what this is supposed to be. Like it changes things. And so this is a good way to represent immutable data in a very interesting way that also can be distributed, because we're kind of generating these things. And once we send it out, if this identifier is different at all, we know that it's different data underneath. So how does this deal at all with versioning? And so one way that you can think about it is we're going to combine the commits, which is, okay, we're going to make modifications. They're pointers into the Merkle DAG, which we can think about as trees with blobs. And so this comes from, I just pulled this diagram because I think this was pretty nice, where it described what we just saw was the Merkle tree, or the Merkle DAG. And you notice here how the leaf is that blob, the file here. But there could be other Merkle trees that, like I said, that because this is a content identifier, that the pointer could represent the same blob. You don't want to reuse the blob. If you have a starfish.ping, you don't want to have 50 million starfish.pings if they're all very interested. You want to represent that once and then point to it using, so that if this is a folder here and this is a folder here, you're not actually reusing the data. And what the commits do is they're basically reaching in and providing pointers to the various parts of this sprawling, chain of Merkle DAGs. Kind of mind-blowing, isn't it? It's all of this stuff is immutable. It gets built up. You kind of, if you really want it to be really more hack-proof, you start using hashes that are cryptographically, cryptographic hashes, so that in order to break them, in order to fabricate a particular underlying thing, you're going to have to spend a whole lot of time in order to try to generate that. And in fact, most of them are not breakable. And so this gives you a pretty good infrastructure to build off of. Okay, so that's kind of like how you handle versioned files in a distributed way using some of these new technologies. And it kind of rolls in a little bit of what blockchains are doing now. And, there's a ton of infrastructure already built that's like for protocol labs and various other things. So now we're going to talk about databases a little more. And I'm going to try to go a little bit faster here. So we're going to talk about data structures 101 for databases. And this is going to simplify things quite a bit, but I'm going to talk about like B trees and log structured merge trees. And if you've studied databases, or so B trees are what you might see with a Postgres or, a SQL Server or various other things. And LSM trees are what you might see if you've used Badger, which is a Go key value store that dgraph uses, or if you use RocksDB, or you've heard of LevelDB, by which a lot of the Google stuff is built on. That's all log structured merge trees. So there are two fundamental kind of algorithms, but I'm really doing a disservice to database stuff. It would be an entire field into itself to go into this. And this is just an example of how you might categorize this from a Harvard paper, where they tried to break down, if you're studying databases, there's all these variations, and we might talk about B trees and LSM trees, and that's this column and that column, but there's all different ways of breaking down techniques of how to do data storage. It's just way too complicated, but we're going to try to simplify it, talk about B trees and LSM trees. And you notice here, there's this RUM here, where, it's talking about these different techniques, and some have the arrow down, some have the arrow up. And what that really is something called the RUM conjecture, which is you have read overhead, you have update overhead, and you have memory overhead. And very much like a lot of distributed systems kind of work, they have this thing optimized to at the cost of the third. And so you can do really good at read and updates, but you're going to sacrifice the memory, or you can, do really good at reading, and up, like just choose two of the three. And generally, you could kind of say that defines like the spectrum that you deal with, and it's all about trade-offs. So let's talk about B trees. So B trees have been around for 40 plus years. It's a self-balancing tree. So this is an example of very simple B tree where you got keys 1 through 7. So it's a key value. I'm just thinking about this in terms of key values. You're storing a key with 1 through 7, and there's some data, D1, D2, D3, D4. So the key 1 is corresponding to D1. So what it is, it's just like a tree where you have, there's anything that's less than 3, anything that's more than 5 or more is on this branch, and everything that's in between goes here. And so it's a self-balancing tree so that if you decide that you're going to insert 4.5, it goes down over here. And then but you notice how we're kind of rewriting the data, that it's not like before where if you had a block here, you've basically done a content addressable hash and you sealed it. This stuff is being modified, usually in memory, and then it spans out into disk. But it's a really fast way that you can quickly get at your data, so that if you know that you're looking up a key at a certain thing, you can immediately tell, just by going through the tree, you quickly hone down into exactly where the value is. And you may have to pull this up from disk. Now, in contrast to this, the B trees on one side, which is in place, you have the situation of a log structured merge tree, where now we're kind of optimizing on writes. And so when you insert data, and this could be in memory. So you've basically got this thing sitting in memory, you insert it, and when you keep on filling this in, and all this is just statically here, you keep on filling in the data into the mem table. So it's really fast. And at some point it gets filled. And when it's full, you sort the whole buffer, and then you flush it. You flush it to disk like that. And then you flush it to this particular level. And if that level gets filled, then you kind of move it, you merge it to the next level, and vice versa. And so the issue here is that, you're just kind of flushing it. You're not trying to do in-place writes. So one issue is that you could have several states of the key value X throughout all of this, because you just basically overwrite it and you dump it. You overwrite it and you dump it. And so how do you actually get the value that you want? You're not doing an in-place write. And so one way is that you just grab the data that you need. So reconciliation happens. Let's say I want a whole span of data, and you can pull the chunks of the data there, and then you can figure out which ones correspond to the key that you're doing. Some of this is out of date, some of it's not. So it establishes this precedence, and then it'll return the value that you really need, or a tombstone, like if you've already deleted it. And at some point you go through, and there's all these old values can be compacted away. So that happens off asynchronously, off on the side. And so what you can kind of see from this is that if you're looking at the spectrum of B tree on one side and log structured merge trees on the other, B trees are kind of read optimized in the sense that, it's really fast to read the thing, but you're going to have to do in-place writes. And so that might cause you to change the tree, and then you got to rebalance the tree. And so depending on when you write and if things need to be adjusted, there could be a lot of stuff going on with the writes. So the writes tend to be a little bit slower. But in terms of reads, you can quickly go through the tree and find where you need it on disk. Now on the log structured merge tree, it tends to be a little bit write optimized, because, hey, we got all this stuff in memory. If we're writing, we're just throwing it into that memory until we just dump it to disk. And we're going to worry about how to handle all of this reconciliation when we ask for the data. And also this compaction, is going to have to happen, or else, we're going to accumulate a lot of data. So what if we actually thought about reconciliation here from a versioning perspective? And that was one of the things that I was thinking about, because I'm basically using this, a key value store. I was building a Go system that was actually using a C level DB, but now I'm also using the Badger system from dgraph, which is pure Go mostly. So this is what, we were just seeing DVID before. Everything gets boiled down to this key value interface. The cool thing about key value interfaces, which are really implemented quite easily by log structured merge trees, at least that's what I've been using. It could be a B tree, but I'm using the log structured merge trees here, is that it's very easy, depending upon the type of data that you're storing, you can actually use a whole variety of different systems. So here, for example, we can use embedded databases, and it can sit on your hard drive, an NVMe fast SSD. And so for some of the data, we put it on fast NVMEs, which are sitting really rapid, so you can get like microsecond access. And you have a layer, a versioning layer on top of this key value. But if you want to get a little bit larger, you can go to group cache, which is also in Go. It's for immutable key value. And you can also do like a blob store, like Google Cloud Storage, which is implemented, or like any of these other things, if you're really talking about petabytes. So if you really need massive petabytes and you're willing to do, higher latencies, you can use key value systems, or ones that reflect it, like the blob stores in the cloud. Or if you want really fast latencies, you could use it. So that's one of the interesting things to me, is that that when you're building versioning on top of key values, key value store, you can choose how you implement it, or in fact, you can implement all of the above like DVID does. So how do you actually build versioning on a key value store? I'm just going to give you a simple thing. You have a key, you have a value. All we're going to do is we're going to throw the version identifier onto the end of the key. That's it. So if you have version like this, just think about it from a linear versioning thing, V0, V1, V2, and we've stored a value here in V0. So it's a key, and it's at V0, and it's value 0. And later in version 2, I overwrite this key, this particular key. So it's key, but now I've got version 2 and value 2. What we can do when we do a get, all we're doing is we're doing a range query on key start. So basically, we're doing a range query, and the range of keys that we're looking at is, hey, I just want to see all the key values that start with key. So it's going to pull key plus V2. It's going to pull key plus V0. And because I have this notion of a DAG, I know what versions I'm interested in. If I ask for V2, I'm going to say, okay, this is what I need. And I've already got the key value, and bam, I got the value 2. Let's say I want V1. Well, there's nothing here, but hey, I got V0, so I'll return V0. So that's value 0. And if I have V0, oh, okay, I got this. We no longer have access to value 2, right? We're at V0. So it's a very simple way. It's a little bit in the database world, there's a multi-version concurrency kind of control where they have timestamps. This is kind of like an approach to doing that. But it's very simple. You can implement it. You can implement it, just by modifying the keys and using range queries. But you kind of need a key value store that allows range queries. Okay, so in the last, 2 slides, so we're almost done here. This is one way of doing versioning using a key value. Let's say we wanted to get really like a whole relational database, and that's what DLT does, where it's not just key values. We want SQL queries. We want the whole kit and caboodle here. And so if we want to do something like DLT, well, we can start with the B tree, and what they're doing is, okay, this thing uses in-place writes, but instead, let's make these nodes variable length and content address. So instead of these pointers here, we're going to use that content addressability. It's very similar to what we saw with the Merkle DAG. And they're using a special data structure, which is called a Prawley tree. And this was the first I actually ever heard of it was in NOMS, which was a Go program that was written quite a while ago. And it's interesting because it kind of combines B trees with Merkle DAGs. And I can't really get into it because it's complicated in the time that we have here, but it's pretty cool. And I refer you to here to a web page that DOLT uses. I'll post all of these URLs later. But essentially, it's like the B tree, except now instead of the pointers, we have these, content addressable hashes. But even, similar to like we do in the Merkle DAGs, it's a rolling hash. And so it's an attempt to try to marry the, the ability to do B tree kind of things, the database kind of accesses together with the, immutable growth from the lower structures. It's one of the other things that DOLT tries to do is it tries to provide a lot of infrastructure for how you can handle the diffs, the various other. That's why it needs to have a very fine-grained detail about exactly all the changes that happen in the database. So the trade-off there is that, if you're going to be storing massive amounts of data, like that doesn't necessarily need to have every single commit or various other things, maybe the approach that I was talking before is kind of checkpointed, you're kind of just storing it at different things. That might be more along the lines. And so that's pretty much all I wanted to say. We kind of had a tour of the various approaches to versioning and a whole variety of Go systems that do that. And so I will end it there, and we can open it up for questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bill. That was a really, really interesting talk. Anybody have any questions that they would like to share? We got, let's see here. We have one in the chat. Patrick was wondering how you deal with merge conflicts and similar in your image annotation version control. And how do things like gitdiff work for images?
Yeah, so one of the issues with, so grayscale images aren't really diffed. And so that's one of the other cool things about this is that once we wind up with our three-dimensional image, it's, there's a process by which we go through all this alignment and polishing and getting it into a nice, beautiful stack. Once it gets into that stack, it's immutable. So that's when I was talking about that DAG, where really when we ingest the image, it only stays up there at the top of the DAG, the root of the DAG, because we don't change that part. And that's the bulk of the data. That's like 25 terabytes just for one little fly brain. So the grayscale image doesn't change. Now, on the other hand, the segmentation, if you remember the color images that you saw for each of the little pixels, that does change, but we've got some clever ways of doing the compression, and the deltas that we use are based upon these higher level components that we do, where we talk about things like super voxels, that we group many voxels together into larger blocks. And then when we do changes, the mutations aren't like we're painting. Now, if you do painting, yeah, you're changing all this other stuff. And one way to minimize the deltas is that you create chunks. So you have a massive, imagine like you have a two-dimensional image, you break it up into little chunks. If your painting doesn't affect your chunk, you don't have to restore that. You only store the changes that get made, and then it gets layered on. So that's one way to kind of like not have to, you can reuse even image data. And the more segmentate, the bigger the volume, the less likely is that you're going to change everything in the volume. Now, in terms of merge conflicts and git diff, so this is one of the things that I think that DOLT really has been thinking a lot about, which is why they need the whole commit graph. They actually provide queries by which you can even do things like, you can even query on the commit graph itself so that you can see the changes. And it's always going to boil down to the fact that you need some way to see the changes and agree to it or not, or you just have to say that one side wins. And so it really requires that, depending on the data, you have to build an application that provides some kind of feedback that says, okay, this is how I'm going to do the diff, and let you easily see the changes. Now, when you're looking at Git, the diff, the ability to do the quick diffs is that we already have text systems, like text visualization systems, that show you, hey, these are the changes. You see the changes side by side. For any kind of data, if you want to make it simpler, you're going to have to build that, and that's why it's so difficult. I hope that answered the question.
Great, thank you so much, Bill. Anybody else have a question?
Okay, so what I'll do is I'll try to post some of these links to the these really very cool Go open source distributed and versioned data systems, and hope you guys have a good time exploring it.
That's great. Thank you so much. Really appreciate the talk tonight, and I definitely will get this up on our YouTube channel after we get the video. And thank you very much. Really appreciate it, Bill.
All right. It's my pleasure.
All right. So let me see here. I am going to see if my JetBrains